So this is a short introduction or a short presentation about introductions to essays. So when you're writing an essay, it doesn't really matter how many paragraphs it's going to be or how many pages that it's going to be. The introduction is just a really, really important part of that essay. And a lot of times people wonder why. Why is the introduction so important? Or why is a strong introduction so important, or a good introduction? And part of the reason is because it's the first connection that you have between the reader and the writer. And it's that first impression that is made by the introduction. It kind of establishes whether or not the reader wants to continue reading, or whether the reader is interested at all in the topic that the writer is going to talk about. And while it's true that when you're writing for college, all of your teachers are going to have to read your papers, but you still want to be able to make an introduction, create an introduction that interests the reader and encourages the reader to move on. Now, especially if you think about the fact that teachers are going to be reading tons of papers, one of the things that the introduction does is it helps the reader to get from whatever's happening in their real life to the paper. And so the introduction provides that kind of pathway from the life that they're living at the moment to the life that's in the paper. And that's what you get to do in the introduction. Another good thing about the introduction is that it provides a really strong guide for a writer. And we'll talk about this more later. This is, I think, more true for papers that are being written, say, kind of a timed writing, that it provides more of a guide for the writer. But it does provide a guide for the reader, and it helps the reader to know what the paper is going to look like. It's a kind of a map, a road map to the entire essay, and that's why the introduction is so important. And I have the picture here of a plant growing from a seed, because that's what the introduction does. The introduction is really this beginning right here. That's the introduction, and as it goes through, it really provides the basis for getting to this whole plant, which is the essay. So what are the parts of an introduction? Well, there's an attention grabber. There's also the explanation of the topic that you're going to be writing about. And then there's the thesis statement. So the question is, what grabs your attention? I mean, I know that we're saying it's a requirement that the introduction grabs the interest of the reader and makes the reader want to read on. So a difficult question becomes, well, how do you grab people's interest, and how do you make them want to read your paper? Sometimes a surprising fact that you can start off with, or something that's curious, or something strange, or something that's odd can also provide just, a gateway of interest that makes the reader want to keep going on. A joke is sometimes effective, not always, but sometimes. A good quote. Quotes are often a place where people start, because a quote is a quote because it was such a great line that maybe out of the hundreds of other sentences from a piece, this is the one sentence that really stood out. Or maybe from a speech, some famous lines from speeches. An anecdote, and an important thing about the anecdote here is that in this kind of writing, especially for the academic writing, it's not fiction. It's not just a story that somebody's making up. It's an anecdote, which means that it's a personal example from someone's life. You could have an intriguing question, an interesting question, a question that makes people kind of, wonder about something. And a conundrum. A conundrum is kind of a head scratcher. It's a paradox. You're not sure where to go. You might offer this as kind of an introduction to get people thinking and to get them more interested in wanting to know what comes next. As many of you know, one of my favorite writers is Malcolm Gladwell, and Malcolm Gladwell writes for the New Yorker. He works for the New Yorker magazine, but he also writes books. And if you're in any of my classes, I'm sure you have heard me talk about Malcolm Gladwell. So I pulled out a couple of Malcolm Gladwell first lines. Now these are first lines to essays that are maybe 20 pages long, and it was based on this very first line. Some of them longer than the others. You can see this is a very short one, and this is a longer one. There's a couple more on the next slide. So it's not always just the length that kind of grabs your attention. It's the idea that's in that opening sentence. But it was based on these opening sentences from different essays that I felt intrigued enough to continue reading. So the first one is, in the technological age, there is a ritual to disaster. I was really intrigued by the idea of ritual, because you think of a ritual as some kind of a ceremony where there's, you know exactly what you're supposed to do. Step 1, step 2, you're supposed to stand a certain way, you're supposed to act a certain way, maybe there are certain words you're supposed to say. And I thought that was just really intriguing, a ritual to disaster. And that combined with technology. And I was completely intrigued and just sat down and read that essay. The next one, in the late 1970s, John Douglas and his FBI colleague Robert Ressler set out to interview the most notorious serial killers in the country. I thought that was a wild sentence, that these two FBI agents, their goal is to find the most heinous killers in the country and to interview them. And this is their goal. This is how they're going to spend their time. And that floored me. I loved it. A couple more. Tomato ketchup is a 19th century creation, the union of the English tradition of fruit and vegetable sauces and the growing American infatuation with the tomato. That sentence blew me away, because you think of ketchup as being just, it's everywhere. It's in every restaurant. It's in most refrigerators in the United States. There's ketchup packets. There's just ketchup everywhere. And I'd never thought about where ketchup came from. And so when I saw this line, I thought, wow, 19th century. And I never thought of it as being some kind of a combination of an English tradition and an American tradition. And that, I just thought that was pretty cool. And then this final one. There was a moment in the third and deciding set of the 1993 Wimbledon final when Jana Novotná seemed invincible. It's funny. This starts with there, which is, kind of a boring word, and then it builds into something that suddenly, by the time I get to the end of that sentence, I'm a little bit tense, right? Because I realize with some of the words that he's using here, I am going to read something that tells me how this person stopped being invincible. So there was a moment in the third and deciding set. Okay, so this is the time when the tennis match is going to end. 1993, it's Wimbledon. This is like, a huge tennis tournament, and it's the final. So this is the championship match. And it says Jana Novotná seemed invincible. And when I saw that word seemed, what that means to me is that she seemed that way, but that doesn't mean that she was that way. In other words, she seemed invincible, which means that I'm going to read about how she lost. So that when I looked at this sentence, I realized she was ahead. She could have won, and somehow she lost. And that, and being able to read that, how that happened, step by step, I thought, this is fascinating. And I have to say, when I read the essay, it completely blew me away. I think I was sweating by the time I finished the first part of this essay, which was actually about failure. So the second part of your introduction, after you've managed to grab someone's attention, the second part of the introduction is where you really do introduce the topic, and it's kind of general, and you're going to talk about what's the subject of the whole essay, and keeping in mind that as the same time that you're drawing the reader into the essay, you are also creating the background for your thesis statement. You're getting ready, you're getting the reader ready to read your thesis statement, to understand where it came from, that it doesn't just come out of the blue, but that there's a place where from your attention grabber, your attention grabber is connected to the background information, and you're preparing that information for the reader for the thesis. And so I have a picture here of this soil with this plant, because for me, that part of your introduction that is not the attention grabber, although the attention grabber is connected here, but where you're talking about the subject and you're doing kind of a pre-explanation of your thesis, that's the soil to me. That's getting all that soil ready so that when you do plant the seed, when you do plant that thesis statement, it's ready to go, and the reader is completely ready to learn more about the topic. Now, the third part of your introduction is your thesis, and there's a different presentation about the thesis, but your thesis statement really guides the essay. Your whole essay relates back to this particular sentence, this thesis statement. And so it becomes arguably the most important sentence that's in your essay. Good thesis statements, strong thesis statements, they're arguable. It's not just a statement of fact. It's arguable, it's specific, it gives a purpose, it's the controlling purpose for the whole essay. Every other paragraph in the essay is written to support this thesis statement, to prove that this thesis statement is correct or is true. One of the other things that the thesis statement does is that it answers the question. If you're writing for school, it means that you have some kind of a prompt or some kind of question that you're supposed to answer. And this thesis statement provides that answer. There's a little bit of a cartoon here, but it's a good cartoon. The successful thesis statement is usually one sentence. It doesn't have to be a short sentence, but it's usually one sentence. It's not a question, it's a statement. Not only does it identify the subject of the paper, because you're doing that in the topic as well, but it also kind of states, takes a stand on something. It's not just a statement that talks about a subject. You're actually trying to take a stand, trying to argue for something here. This is another graphic that I pulled off Google. It's called a thesis generator, and some people use things like this to help them to get started. So you can see what's the topic, what is your stance, or what is your opinion, what is your point of view, what is the rationale, how do you come up with it, why do you have this opinion. You can't just have it because you have it. There have to be compelling reasons why you think something. The concessions that you make to qualify your stance and acknowledge opposition, because of course, especially if you're doing an argument, there's always an opposite side. And then here it shows with this generator, all these things together combine to become the thesis. And if you watch the thesis statement presentation, one of the things you'll notice is that I have something similar in that presentation. Notice that this thesis statement starts off with although, and in the presentation I posted already, there's a way of generating a thesis statement where you might start off with although something and then actually. And that helps you to write the thesis statement. And that's what this generator has done, although the actually is not here. So although some blame the fast food industry for the obesity epidemic, actually parents are more at fault because they are the first to teach and model healthy eating habits to their children. And so this is following that same pattern that I talked about in the thesis statement presentation. Now, just some general tips in terms of getting the introduction going. One of the first things to do is to figure out what's the question you're trying to answer. Sometimes students have a topic in mind, but they don't have a question. And you want to have a question in mind. What's the question that you're trying to answer? And before you actually write that introduction and you write that thesis statement, you want to do some thinking first. You don't want to just put the pen to the paper or the fingers on the keyboard. You want to be able to think, to gather information, to analyze information, to consider information before you begin to write. And one of the other things you want to think about is, what's the scope? And so by scope, I have the spyglass up there because when you look through a spyglass, you are able to change the focus. You can have it zoom out so that you're seeing a really large picture, or you can change the scope and the focus so that it kind of zooms in on something closer or something individual or something specific. So as you're thinking about your paper, you really want to think about what should the scope be of your introduction, not necessarily the whole paper, but of your introduction. Do you want to have a broad scope on your introduction, or do you want to be more specific? And the only way to answer that is to look at your assignment and the question, and also to think about how are you going to answer that question. And here's I think a good tip too, and that is that the introduction comes first in your essay, but that doesn't mean that it's the first thing that you write. In fact, for me, I think over the course of my life, in terms of doing different kinds of writing, I often start off with a short intro, just to get me started. And because if I have a question, or if I'm writing on a certain topic, I'm usually pretty aware of what I want the body to be. I'm more aware of what my arguments are. I'm more aware of why I think something that I think. And so it's easier for me to really get into the body of the paper that I'm writing. I have to have a starter introduction for myself, maybe a thesis statement for myself, so that it will guide the rest of my writing. But my thesis statement is only part of my introduction, so I have to go back and write the introduction. So even though the introduction comes first in the essay, it does not have to be the first thing that you write. And for me, it's not effective for me to write the introduction first. I always have to go back and rewrite it. So you could do that here. You could start with the starter introduction and change it later. But one thing you do want to do, you can see this from those sentences from Malcolm Gladwell, is you want to have a strong focus on the first sentence. Really work on having a strong first sentence. Pay attention to that one, because that's your first impression. That's your chance to grab the reader. One of my favorite novels is called The Magician's Assistant by Ann Patchett. And the very first line of that book, and the book is like 300 pages long, but the very first line is only 3 words, and it says, "Parsifal is dead." That's the first line of that book, and it's a paragraph all by itself. And I don't know why, but when I first opened that book and read that line, I was hooked. And I think it's because the book starts with somebody's death. And oftentimes you think about a book leading up to someone's death. And in this book, he's one of the most important people in the book, and he's already dead by the first line. And so that first sentence often can be the one that grabs people's attention and keeps them there for the whole paper. So really focus on that first sentence.